So yeah, hello Miami, good morning. I am super hyped to be here for the first time. I've been looking for a lot now. And yeah, we're here to discuss a little bit of the history of React, and it's been like a decade already. Wow. Um, Before we start, just a few things. There are a lot of very good resources on the history of React out there. I gotta say, there's a documentary that goes about an hour, and also a lot of interesting live streams like the one from Ryan Carniato, 5 hours history of React. But for, yeah, the next 25 minutes, what I'm trying to do is I do want to revisit the past and also talk about the future, but all the time trying to like come up with intersections of moments we had diverging paths or trouble in paradise, and also what I think that are lessons learned from it. So yeah, the past. And I want to reverse things a bit, so I'm gonna ask your help. What were you doing before React? I'm gonna keep this QR code here for the next 30 seconds. I don't know, jQuery, Angular, Vue, PHP, Rails, anything, like, what are you up to? By the way, it's super tricky to come up with some small talk in the meantime. But I still see some phones and cameras. Okay, time's running. Yeah, so I think we can move to the next slide. Overall, that's what the web was like. We had this first wave of things with backend technologies like Rails, but also a lot in PHP or in the Java ecosystem. We had some DOM manipulation libraries like jQuery or Zapto, etc. And also templating engines were super famous like Handlebars, Jade, and others. And then we had a follow-up wave with the first generation of SPAs and client-side rendering. We had AngularJS, we had Ember, Backbone, Knockout, and others. And then, finally, we got React, we got the next iteration of Angular, we got Vue and Svelte, and now we're approaching the era of the so-called meta frameworks and stuff like that. But that's a topic for another session. Overall, that's what the market was all about. So positions would be looking for these frameworks, the interesting tutorials or the things like the mad science around would be around Backbone, jQuery, etc. Not to mention that the ecosystem revolved around these, so even the less popular alternatives would also be somehow based on these. I really hope this is going to work. So these were your responses. I can relate to that a lot. Yeah, for me it was mostly yeah, I wasn't doing basketball, but a lot of jQuery, Angular, and PHP for sure, and also a little bit of native development, but we're gonna get to there. Overall, that's where Facebook was. So they had this thing called Boat.js, and if you visit the web archive, you can still find the documentation. And overall, Boat was this client-side MVC framework that combined a lot of the existing tools to build complex UI at Facebook. So that included the chat, the news feed, and the timeline, and pretty much a lot of other functionality you can think of. And also, Boat.js was the thing that introduced a lot of things we know nowadays, like the render or the create class thing we had in React, and the idea of refs. As the applications at Meta they grew more and more sophisticated, the complexity of the code base involved, and that's when this guy called Jordan Walk, that most of us probably know as the father of React, created this thing called Facts that you can find over there. And Facts solved the same problems, but in a completely different way. So it was way more functional, there's no MVC architecture, and it also introduced the concept of re-rendering when something in the UI changed. And that was also when a lot of fundamentals we know these days were born. So the idea of props, the idea of state, and also components as we know them in React. Another interesting thing that was happening at the time was XHP. So Facebook was running XHP since 2010, and it was basically an extension of PHP, and it allowed you to create UIs by using XML literals inside PHP code. And it was first introduced to avoid security problems like XSS and others, but it turned out to be a very convenient way to write reusable components. And we kind of know the rest is history, and we had that, for example, iconic presentation by Pete Hunt in 2013, when he said, with React, you can build applications without even thinking about performance, and the default state is fast. And the web was flooded with posts that were literally talking really good stuff about React. Like, I love this one by Guillermo Roche, CEO of Vercel. It's called Pure UI, and he would say, with this model in place, the programmer is thus relieved from the burden of specifying transition between states or transformation of UI over time. That was 2015. And all we know is that we kind of entered this React growth loop where basically companies would choose React because developers were doing React, and React would choose React because that's where jobs were. And yeah, but life wasn't always easy. And for a lot of moments, there's like plenty pushbacks. This is, for example, when it was first announced. So let's talk a little bit about trouble in paradise, and I'm going to try to group a few patterns, I would say, where I've noticed this. And the first one I'm going to call "You're Missing the Point Of," and I'm borrowing this from a post by Dan Abramov back in 2015, where he would start with, "I've seen React misunderstood by smart people more often than any other JS library. React is packed with ideas that were radical at the time of its introduction. This created an air of controversy that still hasn't quite dissolved." And throughout my journey with React, I was able to validate this thing at different points. But I think one that I can highlight here is back in 22 and 23, I was running a session on the concurrent umbrella of features of React. And I would interact with the audience just like I did with you. And I would ask their feedbacks, opinions, impressions, etc. on concurrent React. And you can see that most of the responses, for example, was pointing that concurrent React is about parallelism or multi-threading or web workers, when it's not. It's more about scheduling and this kind of thing. But moving forward, Dan's post continues. After a year of using React and observing people learning it, I can say that the best parts of React are not the ones that made it famous. They're not virtual DOM, custom event system, server rendering, or JSX. Rather, there are a few boring, old, and powerful ideas. And I hope you're curious, but we're going to get to these ideas at a later point in this session. Moving on, I've also noticed at different points in time a lot of ecosystem friction with the other OSS projects and the React itself. This was a thing back in 2016, for example, when streaming SSR was shipped as part of React 16. So I'm not talking about the modern streaming SSR we have these days. And basically, a lot of CSS and JS libraries, they just broke because they needed to adapt to the way streaming worked. This was also a thing back in 2020/21 with concurrent React and the fact that a lot of state management libraries like Redux would have to change how they work under the hood to also adapt. And it's kind of a thing nowadays with server components and a lot of other parts of the ecosystem that are having to adapt to the way that server components work so that they wouldn't crash. I do need to cover this one. It's called Next.js is Eating React. And I'm grabbing this from Kent's post. That is a really good post that you want to check, by the way. But what I'm sensating is that for a lot of the members in the community, the lines between what is the boundaries between what's Next and what's React and how they're evolving together are getting more blurred. And what I feel is that this builds up some certain notion of complexity, and complexity is a good keyword that takes us to the next point, that is an overall growing resentment that shows up from time to time. So this was a thing when we got React. So this was, people argued that JSX was against separation of concerns, and it got to a point that even the Vue documentation had to write down a whole thing explaining how separation of concerns doesn't mean separation of file types. This was also a thing when people figured out that React was not really reactive, or when hooks started to being more and more used, or sometimes overused or misused, and it got to a point that some people would argue that you needed an entire 20 pages post by Dan Abramov so that it could understand how use effect works. And when you finally did, you got use layout effect and use insertion effect too. With the whole umbrella of concurrent React features, it wasn't so much different. And now we're seeing the same phenomenon with server components. And I think that what explains this better are the memes on Twitter out there on this growing notion of complexity. But you know what? This growing resentment is nothing new, and you can find posts from all the moments throughout its history. And I do love this one by Jared Palmer. He posted back in 2019, so way before the server components narrative. And the bottom line is, don't worry, it will make sense. You just need to completely reconfigure your brain. And when I read this from 2019, I do connect a lot with this post by Cassidy early this year, 24, where she highlights that React has gotten really, really hard to understand. And I think now I can anticipate the first takeaway, or I would say lesson learned, is that the cliche is true. Software development in general is always going through cycles. And that's true for features. So a lot of, this is Andrew Clark, also core team member, highlighting how a lot of the inner working of Fiber and comparing a work in progress tree and a current tree, and this whole idea borrows something from is borrowed from something called double buffering, which has been around in the game industry for decades. And a lot of things that not only React, but the whole web has been experimenting with since 2020 have been experimented by the Marco team back in 2014. So good ideas and features and et cetera, they're always going through cycles, and that also applies for trouble in paradise moments. So it's key that we think through like what's different now. And I think that this post reflects it really well. This is a post by them in 2022, where they say that one lesson we've learned is that it's frustrating to the community to wait for new features without having insight into the paths we're exploring. And they also highlight some of these paths were successful and many more were dead ends to lead to new insights. And speaking of insights and reflecting on things, I do love this tweet by Lee Robson, also Vercel, where he basically explores and enumerates how a lot of developers' tools basically pushed other tools to the future. And pushing to the future could be by improving performance, or DX, or API design, or even defaults. And I do connect this a lot with the post by Guillermo from 2016, where he said that React is such a good idea that we will spend the rest of the decade exploring its implications and applications, which is kind of what we're doing now, 8 years after this post. And I think that it's important that we see how React pushed us to the future. So that's takeaway number 2. It pushed other frameworks with concepts like JSX, or by making VDOM popular at the time, or even improving productivity with things like HMR and fast refresh. It also improved our platform. So a lot of the native task scheduling API or umbrella of APIs that is being developed right now has been done in cooperation with the team. And actually, React even uses things like its input pending behind a feature flag. Not to mention discussions around effect handlers and many other things that could improve JavaScript as a language. Now back to Kent's post, he says something that is, I prefer to focus on a framework that can not only give me what I want from the UX perspective, but also give me the skills I can use wherever I develop it for the web. And coming from a native iOS development background, I couldn't stress this more, because I saw how React inspired other platforms. And that includes Flutter, also native Android stuff like Jetpack Compose and LiFo, and on iOS, SwiftUI, ComponentKit, Yoga Layout, and even adaptations we had at the time from Redux or Flux or whatever was the cool thing that React community was doing. And the reason why I highlight this is that it's easy that we come up with things like before cars, we had no car accidents. And one example I can give outside of the React realm is actually, who here has done CoffeeScript before? So yeah, few hands. A lot of people don't know it, and a lot of people actually hate it, but it was CoffeeScript that inspired the arrow function syntax that we got in ES6. This one is going to be, who here has ever done Ember before? Yeah, like 10 people. So one of the most popular routers in the React community, React Router borrows a lot of inspiration from what the Ember router was doing back in 2014. So that's massive. And I wish I could talk more about the best, but there's a lot of things coming down the line in 2024. And so let's skip a bit to the future. So they team, every year they come up with this post basically sharing what they're working on. So I do recommend that you check the last one published about 2 months ago or something. But besides what's highlighted in this post, we got a lot of RFCs moving. So things like FastJSX, this one is fresh last week, and that intends to optimize the JSX runtime. And also old RFCs, like the one for suspense from CPU outbound trees. So that's around since 2020, and it's still moving. Also, a lot of things that for a lot of time were considered future are now turning into present. So the off-screen thing that is now named activity component, or the React Forget project that's now React compiler and is promised to ship this year. Also, things you would need third-party libraries like optimistic state updates are now built in with hooks like use optimistic. And APIs that Meta frameworks are using, like resource preloading and transition tracing and a lot of other things. I also feel like I have to highlight what's going on in the React Native realm, especially because it's been a while since I listed React Native, so it's easy that we just keep an eye on what's happening on the web. But there's static Hermes, which is basically an improvement to the Hermes JS machine. And static Hermes aims to modify the JavaScript semantics to allow efficient sound typing. And the idea is that it bridges the predictable C performance with the usability we can have in JavaScript via native ahead-of-time compilation. And you can mix and match bytecode and native code based on your needs. I urge you to watch this amazing session by Svetan Mikov, one of the guys in the team working on that. But the benchmarkings are super, super promising. Also, React strict down. So if you've tried to write code bases that share a lot between React Web and React Native, you've probably seen projects like React Native Web. This is a whole other approach that's based on small polyfills that are responsible for translating the APIs to both React Native and React DOM primitives. And the goal is that you have less overhead when running in the browsers. And also it's powered by StyleX, the new thing that was open sourced by Facebook last year, I guess. And again, I do recommend a lot that you check the RFC by Nicholas, one of the guys working on it. But overall, React is going more and more places. We now have proof of concepts running React on computer vision by Apple. So yeah, yeah, it's a good thing. There are a few other lessons learned I think we can talk about that I didn't manage to fit in other sessions, so let's cover them. I think that all of these things we briefly covered today show that React kind of acts as an agent that makes popular certain kinds of CS knowledge for us front-enders. So things like DSLs, compilers, concurrency, fibers, effect handlers, immutability, and a lot of other concepts that we probably saw during our grades, and we would never work with them. Because of React, we surfaced them. And I think that's really great. Another thing is that we tend to see a lot of correlations in places where they're not. So there's no silver bullet, no matter the new feature or the new concept or et cetera. So for example, scheduling doesn't mean better performance. So concurrent React doesn't by definition makes your app faster. Server components, they don't mean by definition a better offering experience or even better performance. So let's go with the cliche that there's no silver bullet. And as Kent said, let's identify the core metrics that are important to our apps, to our sites. Also, whenever we have these cycles where it really feels like diverging paths, remember that JSX also created a similar feeling amongst the developers worldwide. So at the time, it was going against so many best practices that a lot of people thought it would never be considered a good idea. And yet, here we are. Another thing is, I'm strong that React is still good enough for most of us, because I don't think there's anything inherently broken about it. And also, it will take something that's a lot better to replace it, and I don't think we're there yet. So if you check benchmarks on the client, you see that playing React is still doing really well. Also, there's this super popular benchmark going on Twitter that is focused on SSR, and you're going to see again that React on its own is still doing great. And I do agree a lot with this tweet by Adam, where he said, it would be probably best for everyone if React just came out and said, yeah, we'll take you anywhere and everywhere, right up to the top tier, 0.1% of productivity. If you need something beyond that, then go with Solid or Svelte. I don't know if I agree with 0.1%, but I'm pretty sure that React covers a lot of the cases we have. And yeah, if it doesn't, you might need Solid, you might need Svelte, you might need something else. But it's very likely that you and your app are covered by React. And I connect this with Laurie said, he's one of the founders of NPM, and he raised that. In my experience, frameworks never get replaced by something that's incrementally better. They get replaced by a totally different way of doing things. And he continues, I have yet to see a thing that looks fundamentally different from React growing in popularity. And I'd like to now go back to Guillermo's post from 2015, where he says, in general, comparing libraries or frameworks in terms of features seems inferior to examining the model it imposes on the programmer. The latter will inform you about how well the code will fare over time as the product matures and the team grows, but the former won't. It will also empower you to foresee what evolutionary path of the technology looks like. And connecting this to the continuation of Dan's post, now that we're not surprised by VDON anymore and it's being adopted by other frameworks and libraries, we can focus on examining React's true strengths: composition, omnidirectional data flow. I would say that freedom from DSLs didn't age well, but explicit mutation and static metal model. So if we highlight just these, I think that's the question we should ask ourselves. Does React in 2024 still have these? And moving on, and you probably know this, but the reports of a tool, of the depth of a certain tools, are always or mostly exaggerated. They're based on outrageous claims, they lack evidence, they lack justifications. And this has happened before to VDON, where people said that VDON was dead, and then we got React, and then they said VDON was dead again, and we got Medallia.js. It has happened to other tools like Ruby on Rails or other parts of the ecosystem. And that has happened to entire languages and ecosystems like PHP. And if we see a lot of the posts that are claiming that React is dying, this kind of thing, most of them, they finish with something like, but you know what, I can't quit React, I can't quit the ecosystem. And I'd like to bring numbers to back this up. So this is State of JS 2022, where we have the whopping usage numbers of React. But another thing that is also interesting is this. This is the Netlify survey from the last year, and where they would check with clients and etc. And I'd like to highlight this part because, yes, you can see that users are getting less happy with React as it's in the vertical axis, but is it really declining? Not as far as this goes. Actually, it's still growing in usage, as you can see in the horizontal axis. And back to this thing, this is a post from actually the PHP community where this person raises, yeah, I hear the axiom PHP is dying since 10 years. So I kind of have a similar thing for this, of course not 10 years. And another thing I highlighted is this, it died for me 10 years ago. So yes, depending on your case and your path, React might die, but just for you or just for a small group. And the last takeaway here is, I think that one thing it all shows is don't trust speculations and future predictions, because again, they're mostly exaggerated. And you know what they say, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'd like to show you one picture of me about a decade ago. So I was talking about Ionic at a native developer meetup for iOS developers, and I told them they should drop whatever they were doing and start investing in Ionic and Angular, because that would be the entire future of mobile development. So native Android is still here and growing, native iOS is still here and growing, and React Native and many others are still around. So yeah, by the way, this is me. I'm Matheus Albuquerque. You can find me everywhere as Y Combinator. I'm a senior software engineer at Medallia. I'm a GD in web performance, and I'm a huge soccer fan. So also, let's talk about soccer and React. Thank you all for having me in Miami. Here you can find this presentation and many other presentations I have on performance, internals of React, and other stuff. It's really great to be here, and I'm so looking forward to the rest of the conference. Everything is just amazing. Thank you all.